Hello and welcome to this all-new episode of In Session, Bennington to Montpelier. I am your host, Jack Rossiter-Munley, and I'm coming to you from the Bennington County Multicultural Community Center here in beautiful downtown Bennington. And I am so happy to be joined by Representatives Mary Morrissey, Tim Corcoran, and William Greer, and Senator Seth Bongartz. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of In Session.
Morning.
Morning.
Thank you for having us.
All right. So I know it has not necessarily been the biggest headline grabbing news of the week, but I feel like it is the biggest thing that's happening throughout this legislative session. And especially since we have you with us today, Senator Bongartz, I wanted us to spend some time discussing education reform. I'll start with you in terms of where the governor's proposal stands in terms of its movement through the legislature, and then also the last time that you were on, you talked a little bit about your alternative vision for education and where your proposed alternative and where other proposed alternatives are at this stage as this topic continues to move forward.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, it's maybe even, I don't know if it's more clear or less clear where things are headed at this point. The governor's proposal, I think I said the last time, and it remains true, that the notion of the 5 districts is not going to happen. I think everybody knows that, including the governor's office. So the action more recently has been in the House as they're trying to get a bill over. And I haven't seen, it's not finalized yet, so it's a little hard to talk about all the components, but it does include, I think the key thing, well, a key thing that includes is from the Ways and Means Committee, if they can get it out, it's still not out yet, is the notion of a foundation formula. Another way to think about a foundation formula is a block grant. So each district will get, depending on how many kids there are, students there are, and the weights that attach based on things like poverty, English as a second language, those kinds of things. So that will be almost certainly, and I know that that's where the Senate Finance Committee is headed as well. I have lunch with the chair of that committee every week to make sure that our work is meshing. And what the House is doing otherwise is a little, what the part of it that's going to come out of the Education Committee is, it has things like minimum class sizes and other things. So we'll just have to see. And then we'll get it. It'll take a little while because of the way that things appear in the notice calendar. Voted the first day, voted the second day. Then it kind of lays over before it comes to the Senate. So it's going to take, we won't see it for real until the week after next in the Senate, assuming it goes through the House at all. I think there's, I don't know, I guess I won't characterize the House bill yet. We'll just let it come over and see what's in it and what we can work with or not.
And then from the House side, I guess I'll start with you, Representative Greer, in terms of what you're hearing about the sort of the House proposal that's getting put together, and also just in general how the conversation around this is developing.
Well, for me at least, I'll just touch on the part of the bill that I've been most concerned about, and it doesn't necessarily affect any schools in our town in Bennington, but definitely processes around small schools closing. I feel like there's not really a formulaic way to do that, and I feel like it would put it kind of in the hands of the State Board of Education to kind of make some of those decisions, at least from the rough draft I've been reading through. And that's a concern that I really want to see brought up. I think there should be some form of due process and community input into making those huge decisions about whether or not a school is going to stay open or not. Senator Bongartz was correct in that there are class size minimums and other things like that that are somewhat scripted in the bill, but I think necessary to create, an equal playing field across the state. So that's been my input. I haven't read through the full bill. It's a pretty big bill, but that's hopefully my goal this week because it should be on the notice calendar and on the floor later this week.
And I guess an extension of this, and Representative Corcoran will come on to some of the ways that the federal funding pressures are coming into the transportation world. We've already talked about that a little bit on the show before, but some of the news that's been coming out this past week is about a sort of $16.7 million shortfall in anticipated federal reimbursement funding for schools that may or may not still exist and may or may not end up getting processed. I'm curious how the conversation around some of that federal funding uncertainty is playing into this local, well, not local, statewide effort to rethink education in the state of Vermont.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that's a big cloud over the state of Vermont and the people that live here is the unknowns. There's real potential that there's going to be drastic cuts on the federal level, and it's sort of like a wait and see approach, and it's not only the federal dollars. I mean, I would argue that our state revenues are going to take a hit too. And I'll give you an example. We have the emergency board, which is made up of financial analysis of the governor's side and the House side, or the legislative side, and they come to an agreement on what the projected revenue is going to be for the coming year, and they meet in January, and then they meet, I think, in July. But those projections that they did in January don't include the tariffs that are going into effect. And when you look at my world of transportation, you look at the tariffs on cars, and they're projected to increase a car between $5,000 to $10,000. And one of the positive things that we had going in the transportation world as far as revenue was the purchase and use tax. I would argue that that projection is probably no longer valid. And you have a lot of things like that throughout government that are going to take a direct hit. So, the budget that we do pass, I think there's going to have to be a lot of rescissions and um, cuts. And I'm not sure. Typically once we adjourn, we adjourn. We come back for a veto session, but I'm not sure if it would make sense for the legislature even to come back in the fall to sort of re-engage and figure out what's what. I'm not encouraging that, but if there are major repercussions, I think we should be at the table and have a voice and see how that's all going to sugar out. But yeah, no, getting back to the ed bill, it's as Seth Bongard said, it's just a moving, living organism, and just to sort of give the viewers out there as far as the class sizes that we're talking about. I just have some notes here. Is that that the kindergarten, the average minimum class size would be 12 students. Grades 1 through 4, the average class size would be a minimum of 15 students. And grades 5 through 12, the minimum class size would be 18 students. So we sort of, that's one sort of concrete thing that we did. The House also set up a subcommittee, because as the House, Committee on Education was starting to look at the lines, it became clear to us that that was a bigger task that we could accomplish within the time frame that we're given. So this committee that's made up of 5 individuals is going to come back in December of this year to give us 3 recommendations of how those lines should, sugar out, and so we'll have a voice, and or we'll have to pick one of them if we feel that hopefully one of those 3 is suitable. But yeah, that's where we are. I think we're trying to get on the same page with the Senate so we can be one, and then the governor, like I said, that's still in work in progress for the education, is how that's going to come down. The governor's made clear of what he wants, and I'm not sure if we reconnected yet on or connected on his wishes and where our vision is. So it'll be an interesting next couple of months for sure to see it all plays out. But the governor, I think, without saying it, said he's going to veto the budget. And And that's one of the things that keeps us here, because obviously we need a budget. So something's going to have to give. So, I guess stay tuned.
And it has been interesting to hear some of what the governor's been talking about. He's alluded to the idea of possibly extending the session in the interest of having education reform accomplished during this session. I'm curious for your take, Representative Morrissey, as someone who has experience serving, both about that dynamic with the governor and the legislature, and then also what you see as the challenges and the potential of these education reforms for Bennington specifically.
Well, again, someone who I started in 1997, and my first year was Act 60. So I have been through a major change in education on several levels, and then a couple of years ago with Act 49 that merged a number of our school districts or our schools together within districts. And I have to tell you, when it comes down to education, it can be a very concerning issue. I mean, I've been hearing from a number of constituents on a whole host of concerns and issues for their children and how this is going to work. I will be interested in seeing both pieces of legislation from Seth's committee as well as the House committee's proposal. Like others have said so far, we will be taking it up this week, the House H54, and it'll be interesting. We on Tuesday we actually are going to have a caucus of the whole in order to listen to what is being proposed within H of 454. I've read it. I'm going to be on I normally need to read it a number of times to, really look at some of the questions I have. But my concern is, yes, obviously we do need to have some change and improvements in what we're doing and to get the funding under control. However, there are some very significant concerns within how we do that. And, I'm hearing, we talk about the money piece, we talk about, size of classes, we talk about who's merging, but we sometimes lose the focus on what the quality of education is for our children, which again, under some of the former proposals, has not always come down to providing a great quality education for our children. And that for me is a huge focus that we have to do. So it will be interesting for us to take this, I think, our time in putting forth a solid education piece that hopefully all Vermonters can get their arms around and feel that they have been heard as to the importance in their area. Because, as I said, watching the merging process under Act 49 was very difficult. And, you're still hearing of that, of districts that just really felt disenfranchised from the poll process. And moving forward, we need to be careful. But again, I'm encouraged and I've appreciated that's committee in looking at, because when it was initially said by the governor's office that there would only be 5 supervisory districts, I thought, we can't go from one extreme to the other and think that's going to work well either. We have to have a plan in place that downsizes appropriately to fit the needs of our schools on many levels. And again, we have to, under the Act 60, we've got to make sure we're providing, and again, that's always been a big question mark, a quality education, but an equal education for all students across Vermont. So I'll leave it at that at this point. I think we'll have more of an education piece this week. We will be debating the bill on H454 on. It will be introduced on Wednesday, and we will be debating it on Thursday and Friday.
Thank you for that. And then I guess I'll come back to you, Senator Bongard. So as the House bill is coming through, what are your hopes for how it will come over to the Senate side and what the process will look like for having something move forward?
Well, I think if the House can get over the ways and means part of the foundation formula, I mean, that's a key part. I think I agree, by the way, with everything Mary said, that it's really really important that we keep educational quality at the top of this and not end up with a one-size-fits-all approach, because Vermont is various regions of Vermont. We have some parts that are very rural. We have some parts that are more urban. And it's really dangerous to do a one-size-fits-all approach. And so I think, we have to be careful that as we're trying to put this together, that we don't end up doing it's very easy to end up with unforeseen damage. And so I think we have to be careful. So I'm wary of one-size-fits-all, and I'm wary of mandating school sizes and class sizes. I think we can get to a place that works and that moves things in the right direction. I mean, it is true, and I think Representative Morrissey, and I think everybody has said, and Representative Corcoran said this, we need to get to a place, we need to gain more efficiency. I mean, for Vermont to have 52 supervisory units and 119 districts with 85,000 kids is a little excessive. And it's kind of by definition inefficient. And so we need to have a more efficient governance model, that goes to more like, that does bring us to the point of having larger class sizes, but we have to do it in a way that recognizes some areas of the state, smaller schools make sense, are going to need to continue to make sense. And anyway, we just have to do it in a way that lets those decisions be made more at the local level, set up the framework, set up the funding system that does kind of require that efficiency emerge, but let that happen more organically at the local level than trying to mandate it from Montpelier. So that's kind of the way that I'm approaching this. I think the idea that we're going to end up with maps this session is not, that's not going to happen. It's the House isn't even contemplating maps. And by the way, that the one area that I know I don't agree with the House position, and I don't mean these guys, I mean the committee. What the committee is proposing is that we have some commission draw the maps. I think that's drawing maps is our responsibility. And so what I suspect my committee is going to propose, and the Senate position will be more along the lines of, if we're going to set up some mechanism for drawing lines, that it be done with a group of legislators that gets identified. And then, I do think that it probably was too ambitious to try to do maps this session. There's logic to it, but but legislation and getting people to understand where we are is a lot more than just immediate, like, sort of intellectual logic. We have to give people a chance to feel like they've been heard. And so I think this commission, who's ever on it, is going to spend a lot of time getting to know Vermont, because I think we're going to have to go around the state and really take in testimony, listen to people, because where those lines are drawn, when they are, it really matters that there are nuances around the way that travel corridors work, how the tech centers interface with all of this, and historic patterns of people that think of themselves, within this group of towns as a community. And for us just to try to do it without really understanding all of that is going to end up with mistakes that have real consequences for people being made. So this notion of spending some time getting it right is something that I have, first I did really think we needed to move quickly, and there's rationale for all of that, but I'm comfortable with the notion that we take the emphasis off one size fits all, and that we really take the time to get the maps right. So that's where I hope we can end up, in a way that we can bring the bodies together.
And there will be a lot to follow in the coming week as this is moving forward in the House, and also as the whole process continues and it does become more real. It's been very real since the governor put forward his proposal and indicated how serious he was about this. But now, as it's moving through the legislature, there will be something, it sounds like, in the next, very soon will come before.
Yeah, and I know you want to move on to other topics, and we should, but just a quick I give the governor credit, even though there's a lot in the governor's plan that I'm not going for, that I don't think is, I don't agree with. But I do want to acknowledge that the governor could have used a much more blunt instrument just to drive down tax rates. And what the administration is saying is that, no, we have a systemic problem, and we need to have the courage to take on the systemic problem. And they're right about that. And so they put something out there. I don't think it's quite right. There's elements of it I agree with, and some I don't. And I'm sure that's true of everybody. But I do give them credit for saying we have a systemic problem and we need to take this on systemically.
I appreciate that. And on a couple of topics that you raised here in the context of education, the need for being really conscientious about the rural needs versus more urban needs, and also systemic challenges, I do want to talk a little bit about transportation. There was the study that was done about public transportation, where obviously that's another realm where there's very seriously different needs for the rural and urban networks of public transportation. But on the systemic level, there's also been the news about the anticipated amount of road paving that's going to be done in the next year, and the very significant reduction in mileage year on year, as well as an ongoing reduction in the amount of money available, going from 141 million to 130 million to a projection of $103 million, and a reduction in road paving from about 220 miles to 125 miles of road paving in a year. That's about 45% reduction. So from your perspective, Representative Corcoran, I know we've talked a little bit about the funding pressures on the way that transportation is currently funded, but maybe you can talk about just what does that reduction in road paving mean for people here in Bennington, for Vermonters who are getting from point A to point B? What does that actually look like in terms of the operations?
It's, it's tough decisions, ultimately. We need to do, there's an analysis that every 10 years we're supposed to, address the paving on roads. And that, to do that, we need to be paving I think it's roughly 330 miles, give or take. And obviously the numbers you just relayed is a far cry from that, and it's getting less and less. So, I mean, what are the ramifications? It's as unfortunately the roads are going to be deteriorating at a faster pace than that we can repair them. So, more potholes and that is a huge issue is how do we avoid that. And it's trying to generate more revenue or sustainable revenue, maybe not new, but sustainable in the fact that the things that we have to fund our transportation budget aren't probably the most reliable nowadays. The gas tax is declining. There's, I don't know, 60 or 70 million dollars of less gas that's being sold over the last 10 years or so. Um, EVs obviously are taking a big chunk out of the gas revenue. The purchase of sales, which I talked about, the cars are expensive, so the sales are, stagnant on that end. So we need, a new thing. And not to repeat myself from last week, but one of those things is miles based. MBUF is to charge for miles traveled, and this is just for electric vehicles. To trying to recoup some of the revenue, and you were talking about the effects of federal cuts. That was one of the cuts that affected this program. We had a grant of $3 million. Hasn't been officially cut, but it's on the chopping block. We'll know in hopefully another month or so whether or not we're going to receive that. But seeing assuming we do and it moves forward, that will generate between $4 to $7 million. So I mean, it's not going to get us to where we need to go, but it's a step in the right direction. But yeah, there's and as far as public transit, the rural providers are looking at a $1.5 million cut, and the effects around here. I believe the route from Bennington to Wilmington to Brattleboro is might get cut, and that's unfortunate. But when you have limited funds, tough decisions have to be made. And I know the agency is going through their analysis. They're trying to come up with what's feasible to cut and what's not. And they should have an answer of what routes are unfortunately going to make it probably within the next month or so. But that's that's what we're elected for. Those are decisions that we have to make. Some of them aren't pretty, but at the end of the day, when your funds are limited, that's what we're forced to do. Because right now it's probably hard to go out and propose new tax or fee. Obviously the governors, and not that I'm proposing this, but the governors made quite clear that that's not going to be allowed. So when you're sort of constrained by that, these are the effects of that. So yeah, I'll leave it there. But sort of, I just wanted to mention too, sort of wrap up, the education portion. I just had a note about, we passed the yield bill, and our property taxes last year were, quite substantial at, 14, roughly 14% increase. This year, in January, they projected a, roughly a 5.8% increase. We went along with the governor's recommend of trying to buy that down, and we took roughly around 70 plus, maybe $77 million of, basically one-time money to draw that down to 1.1% increase. I think in our area, we'll probably see a decrease, because that's an average, obviously, as a whole, it's a 1.1% increase. But with that said, the way our revenues are looking this year and the out years, it is going to be a major problem next year to come up with this money to if the rates could obviously continue to rise, and they probably will, is where we're going to get the money to draw down the rate. And it's good in the short term right now with with us using the money to buy it down, but next year is giving me heartburn quite a bit. So that's why it's urgent to move forward on this education and trying to get it done as soon as practical. So just wanted to mention that before I forgot.
Definitely. And the funding pressure is being felt so acutely in so many different areas at the same time is so challenging. Um, I did actually, for totally separate work, I met with Terrence White a couple weeks ago, and he was saying that the annual cost of operating that route between Bennington and Brattleboro is about $57,000 a year, and so it really shows how all of those different routes add up pretty quickly. I'm curious, Representative Greer, when Representative Corcoran and I met a little while ago, he had mentioned that he doesn't necessarily hear a lot from constituents about transportation issues, but it is also something that we interact with every single day. So I'm curious if public transit or other transportation is something that gets brought to you at any point, or that what sort of you hear about in the community, and whether you anticipate hearing more about that as it becomes a more urgent funding matter.
I haven't really heard much about it, to be very honest. In terms of response from constituents, it is something I've thought about, particularly the public transit concerns. I've heard from people that had just vaguely said that there were going to be cuts down here in southern Vermont. It sounds like there's also going to be some up north. In terms of, you know, the transportation fund as a whole, I mean, I do get worried about the federal funding pieces, of course. I do think that the miles based program that the transportation committee's been looking at, I think that needs to take place. I think that gives some fair equilibrium there between people that have, gas powered cars and electric powered cars. And so I think that's just, I think those are some good policies that are coming out of the committee this year. But no, I don't really interface with that too much. Although I wish people would send me more and educate me on where they're at, and just so that I can stay in tune and just know what's going on.
Jack, I would like to respond on the public transit if possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to pass it over to you next.
Okay, well, I do sit on the board of directors and have been a long time member of the board of Green Mountain Express. And yes, as Tim had put forth, that we would be looking to stop performing the transportation travel to the Wilmington over the mountain to that area. It is one of our probably lesser traveled routes, but still, again, that's a concern because that does put the people, even if it's a small number, in some difficulties with their travel in that direction. But that has been, obviously a huge concern with, especially the money committees, whether it's transportation, the overall appropriation bill, as well as our capital bill, which Will and I are on the same committee of institutions and corrections. And I'm very concerned, as I know Will is, about as the different possible cuts or decline in funding from the federal government is not coming through. What does that look like? And again, I can incorporate it with the concerns of we've been in a moratorium on school construction, and I assure you, and I'm sure Seth can, relate the discussions in his committee, we've had school construction and school improvements on a moratorium for now a number of years. I think the Mount Anthony Junior High School was one of the last state, under the school construction that got state aid to build that school. And it was shortly thereafter that it went school construction into a moratorium. So actually, with even going forth with an education bill, we've got, probably hundreds of millions, if not more, in school construction or building new schools for what these districts are going to look at. So, as we're looking at education, it's not just, putting schools together. You've got to be possibly closing schools, but putting them together in a different fashion. So, we've got to be very careful about how we do this and be smart about it and really look at the consequences if we just try to rush something through. And it's not to say, to stall this. It's to really very carefully do this and do it right.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it echoes a lot of what you were saying, Senator Bongartz, in terms of a really, a conscientious process that can be swift, but doesn't necessarily overlook some of the importance of keeping the focus on local needs while also looking at how to create greater efficiencies. I think one of the big questions hanging over the education is what will happen once something comes through the House and Senate and then reaches the governor if it does not match his initially proposed plan. Just this past week, the budget adjustment was vetoed again, and the language the governor used was pretty strong. It is a veto that was mainly based around the hotel vouchers continuing to be included in their current form. But I did want to read part of his statement on the veto because it is very, very strong language. It's the governor wrote in his letter to the legislature, "It's clear we're at an impasse on a non-budget adjustment related policy, which has once again been included in the latest budget adjustment bill. However, nothing prevents us from moving forward with a traditional bill where we agree on the majority of the mid-year financial true-ups. I'm hopeful the legislature will stop sending me bills they know I will veto and instead send me a clean budget adjustment bill without controversial policy so we can move forward with the many challenges we face." I'm curious for your reflection on that, Senator Bongartz, as the veto that's come through, and then what the path forward is for this budget adjustment, if there is one.
There probably isn't one at this point. I don't see the either body taking this up again. We're almost at the point of the big bill is about to come over from the Senate. I mean, from the House. I think the attention will just shift there. I think, to be fair, I think the House and the Senate bent over backwards actually to take out a lot of money the governor hadn't wanted in there, and the amount of money for the hotel and motel program was in the end very, very small. And I was just kind of surprised that he made this a hill to die on. I was disappointed that we had to get to this point. The cost was very small, and for people, we need to fix the program. There's no question about that, and the point was made. That we need to fix the program, and fair enough. But I was just disappointed. So I think, and going back to what you started off by talking about we needed to have the education bill in a place that the governor will sign. And I think we can do that. And I think that is going to require, and I have been, in close communication with the governor's office as we've been doing our work in the Senate to try to make sure that even if, because there's always room around, there's always room to put things together differently. But I think, the governor is going to want to be assured in one way or another that we are truly on a path to make systemic changes that are going to provide us with a more efficient system. And I think everybody would agree that we have to, especially, by the way, in this era of the federal cuts, it's really going to be important that we have ourselves as best positioned as we can with the education system to be able to withstand the damage that's going to get inflicted on us. And so he's right. We need to do it. We need to have a path to make things happen and have them happen relatively fast. I can see us, getting the foundation formula in place this year. With transition to it, it doesn't work nearly as well if it's imposed on the existing structure with all of these districts. Because of disparities, there will be winners and losers in a way that is, that we were trying to avoid. So what I think, but I think if we can get on the path to get something comprehensive through, and the governor gets convinced that we're headed in that direction, we can hopefully find something that he'll sign.
And Representative Greer, I'm also curious for your reaction to the governor's veto, especially since this is your first legislative session. I'm guessing that you're also in contact with a lot of other sort of new legislators, and what the feeling is amongst all of you, both your reaction to the veto itself, but then also what is the kind of tone and tenor of the conversations among some of the new legislators about the dynamic between the legislature and the governor right now?
I mean, I think that the veto wasn't necessarily a surprise because you get to hear all the interactions in the building all the time. I I mean, I think that the biggest concern that people had around it was that in the prior session when I was not there, it seems that there had been a deal that was reached that was kind of providing an exit ramp to the program. And I think the tension really started with the fact that we were renewing that, um, you know, the extending the program further. Even though we had come to this agreement that we were going to start shifting responsibility onto a new program, a more sustainable financial model. And I think that we're at least getting in that direction because we did pass the other day in the House H91, which was a new homeless program that would be more cost effective. And I'm hoping that we start seeing some results from that and start seeing some investment towards that. And that would hopefully draw down our dependency on the voucher system we have right now. And I think that's what everyone wants. So I don't know which way the pieces would have had to fit for that to have changed, but I think that was the big reason why that was so contentious with the veto and just with the passage of it and everything. But yeah, no, I wasn't surprised, from from first year members, I think it is definitely a new world to negotiation and compromise that we're starting to see, and I think there's a lot of things that are changing in the world right now, so it's definitely different take on things from our end.
Jack, I would like to respond to the voucher program and the veto, if at all possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to ask for your response to the veto as well, and then also the fact that the governor has issued his own executive order alongside all of these different actions and has proposed an alternative to the voucher program.
Right.
Your thoughts on both of
And
those.
I have felt very strongly about, yes, obviously something needed to happen, especially during COVID, with getting homeless folks protected. And, obviously during colder or hot weather conditions in our communities. My concern with the program that was put forth, and at the end of the day, we have spent in the last number of years hundreds of millions of dollars that could have looked to have gone towards actual housing that would help house our homeless. I feel kind of at the end of the day, we have nothing to show for spending that amount of money. Yes, we kept folks in, with a roof over their head. But again, the program, I'm not sure if I could say was well I'll back up, had the best oversight that it could have had, because many of the folks, and again, I've said this on another program, and I'm not meaning to repeat myself. Yes, we're a state that looks to help folks out. I get that. But when our own state has the needs, and you could virtually see, and it wasn't like me driving around to see what, license plates were in the motels that we were providing housing for, but there were a lot of out-of-state cars that were in our hotel program, in getting a roof over their head. We need to be looking at, yes, as a state that wants to help others, but we need to help our citizens first. And I'm hoping that, in going forward, and the governor did put forth this week in the executive session or executive order, is that families with children or those with disabilities or health conditions will be extended to stay in the hotel motel voucher system, should they choose to. But I would myself prefer that we actually go forth looking at a strong plan of looking at the true needs in our community, of what we need to help our homeless, for low income, for workforce housing, and the whole thing across the board, so that we can have solid plans going forward and plan and produce what those plans are. Otherwise, we're just, I'm sorry to put it this way, we're going to be like a dog chasing its tail. We're never going to catch up with what the real needs are.
And I think that echoes some of what we've heard in our conversations about education and transportation, this real need for systemic change on a broader level than some of the specific work that's been done up until this point. So it would be interesting to see what kinds of proposals come forward that offer that more systemic approach. Senator Bongartz, do you want to say something as well?
Oh, I was going to mention along the lines of what Representative Morrissey said, that we did, using ARPA dollars, we sunk hundreds of millions of dollars into infrastructure to make it like water and sewer lines, to make it, because that's a key component for building affordable housing. And we also put hundreds of millions of dollars directly into housing. And we've made some changes that make it much easier to build housing in areas where it clearly makes sense to have housing, in downtowns. And that's beginning to work. We're seeing developers building housing. There's all kinds of things still working against them, the cost of materials, the cost of labor. But we've laid the groundwork in a way that is producing units, both sort of what we refer to in the legislature as the missing middle. We focused a lot on technically affordable housing, and that's great. It's really important. We have to do it, and that relates to Representative Morrissey's comment about building housing so that we're not just constantly having to triage. And so that's happening, given the work that we did. But that's taking it all takes a little while, and we're also, because of the work we did, making it easier for developers to build in downtowns, and money that we put into sewer and water infrastructure, help with mobile home parks, those kinds of things. We actually have done a lot that I think we're beginning to see the results of, and building more housing. It's not enough. A lot of things still working against developers, but we've done a lot of things that are paying dividends finally.
And I know there have also been state-funded programs to renovate existing units. So the Vermont Housing
Yeah,
Improvement Program,
yeah,
the VHIP program that
the
provided
VHIP program. Yep.
um, state grants to landlords. And then as part of that program, those units had to be rented at the HUD fair market rates for a certain number of years to certain populations as a way to hopefully provide some of that off-ramp from being unhoused.
And then you see people like Zach Hale doing doing great work in Bennington, really making a lot possible for a lot of people. And there's other Zach Hales around the state, but we're lucky to have them. So
We don't have a lot of time left, but I did want to touch on something. And Representative Greer, in your comment, you mentioned that everything is changing. In the last week or so, there have been some big federal or, well, really national stories that have come to Vermont with the news that Rumeysa Ozturk was held at the ICE facility in St. Albans, that she was flown out of Burlington, and that her detention case may actually come to Vermont. At the Vermont Bar Association mid-year meeting, the Chief Justice of our Supreme Court also made a pretty strong statement about the current state of the rule of law. He said, in part in his remarks, the president, through a series of executive orders, seeks to erect barriers to lawyers who represent clients who disagree with him. No prior administration has taken such concerted action against the bar, an effort to erode an institutional pillar designed to check abuse of power. And so I know that's a little bit more on the judiciary side than the legislative side, but I am really curious how some of these conversations are coming up within the legislature as these larger national concerns do come to Vermont in very concrete ways. Maybe Representative Greer, since you alluded to the changing nature of everything, if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Well, personally, I was up last night reading through the Ozturk case because it is in fact moving to Vermont and in the federal courts. And it would be up now to the federal court in Vermont to determine if it should go back to Massachusetts or some other jurisdiction. I know Louisiana's been floated around because it just sounds like there's been this real shuffling happening. And when I was reading through her case, it sounds like there have been several other cases around the country where people that are here on legal status and have not committed any crime or offense while being here have are being essentially shuffled around to try and, find a more favorable court where they may be able to deport them easier. That's concerning, to me at least, and I think most likely to everyone else. There was a letter that was sent out about 2 weeks ago, kind of related to this around, support for refugee resettlement and hopefully restarting the program. I signed on to that because I think that's important that we support that work. And as it relates to the Ozturk case, just because it's mainly a question around freedom of speech, we may not necessarily agree with one another, but when we don't agree with, I mean, it doesn't matter what status you are in this country, whether you have full citizenship or you're just visiting, the Constitution still applies to you because we can't live in a world where people are being, picked around of whether or not they have those rights. I mean, that's just inherent in our Constitution that it doesn't apply just to citizens. So yeah, I've personally been following that case, Jack.
And, both because of the nature of my day job, but also just in many of the conversations I've had, I've talked to a lot of people, both those who are not yet citizens, but who have green cards or who are on a path to getting green cards, or people who've lived here their whole lives who have been expressing concerns in the last couple of weeks about exercising their First Amendment rights and the possible repercussions of doing so. I'm curious, Representative Morrissey, maybe how you and other legislators are thinking about that on the state level in terms of helping Vermonters feel a little bit more comfortable in these uncertain times.
Well, I think we need to obviously work together to look to protect the folks that are here in our state, who have come in on various different means, and have a plan in place. I mean, some of this has happened kind of so suddenly that it's hard, it's hard to see this happening, and that it has touched even our little Vermont in a way. So I'm hoping that going forward, these issues can be looked at in a respectful manner, to not see some of the things that we are seeing happen across the country, but that are now have touched a bit of our own state, and that there is a respectful way in place to have people's amendment rights, that they're heard and can have representation as well. So, moving forward, some things will have to be put in place for that to happen.
It'll be very interesting to see what kinds of action is taken on the state or even on the local level around some of this. We're almost at time. These are all really important topics that I'm sure we'll continue discussing through many more episodes of this show. But quickly before we wrap up, I know there's many different ways for people to get in contact with their legislators, but I do like to end each one by giving each of you a chance to remind everyone who's watching your preferred method of contact, just because people could reach out in a number of different ways. I want to make sure they know the way that you most like to be contacted. And I'll start with you, Representative Corcoran.
Yeah, the most easiest way is by email. Every legislator has a email, and mine is T Corcoran, so it's TCORCORAN at ledge.state.vt.us. Or you can call, like I said, the Sergeant of Arms. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but you can call the Sergeant of Arms and leave a message, and they'll give it to a page, and they'll hand it to us directly. And we typically good about getting back within the day, or for a response.
Excellent. And Representative Greer?
Yep, I'm the same way. Email. I love to personally write back by letter, and mail that out. And phone calls are also great. 802, I think it's 802-828-2228, and then we'll get the message from there.
Wonderful. I do keep hearing from people who've gotten letters from you, and they really enjoy it.
Thank you.
Senator Bongartz?
Email really works best. I kind of get overwhelmed because I have such a large district, and the little pieces of paper, hard to always find them all at the end of the week. And I have a very because we're on 2 committees in the Senate, it's very hard for me to be able to respond during the week. I try to spend weekends catching up, but email really works best because I frankly start at the top and just work my way down. And so I really prefer email to the messages at the Sergeant at Arms office. It just works better. It keeps me better organized and positions me to be able to respond better.
Excellent. And Representative Morrissey, you get the last word.
My email is mmorrissey, so MMORRISSEY at ledge.state spelled out .vt.us, or you can phone me on my cell phone, 802-379-5439. And thank you, Jack, for another great legislative discussion today.
Thank you all for joining, and I look forward to having you all back on the show very soon.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Thank you, Jack.